Hello everyone and welcome to the introduction to research method in psychology. Module 6. The topic of today's lecture is non-experimental research. The content of this lecture will not be tested during the midterm, but it will be tested during the final. What is a non-experimental research? It's a type of a research when independent variable cannot be manipulated by researcher. In this case, researcher measure variable as they naturally occur. That can be done both in the lab or in the real world. Why does researchers conduct non-experimental research? There are many answers on this question. For example, the researcher is interested only in one variable, but not in the relationship between two variables. For example, how accurate are people's first impressions? We can make an experimental research question for this non-experimental one. If we find a way to overanalyze people's first impression and see how this accuracy related to, for example, the length of their relationships. Another possibility why the researcher choose a non-experimental research is when the research question pertains to a non-causal statistical relationship between variables. For example, is there a correlation between verbal intelligence and mathematical intelligence? Again, we can make an experimental research question for that. Think about it a couple of seconds while pausing this video. So, what's your idea? My idea is how verbal intelligence related to mathematical intelligence. A third possibility why the researcher choose a non-experimental research. It is when the research question is about causal relationships between variables, but the independent variable cannot be manipulated because of ethical reasons. For example, our research question is about how damage to a person's hippocampus impairs the formation of long-term memory traces. Because of ethical reasons, we cannot damage a hippocampus of our participants. In this case, to study our research question, we will conduct a non-experimental research with patients as our subjects. I don't think we should turn this research question from non-experimental to experimental one. And the fourth possibility why the researcher chooses to use non-experimental research is when the research question is very broad and exploratory. For example, what it's like to be a working mother diagnosed with depression. How about we turn this research question to experimental one? For example, we can study the relationship between mother's depression level and the amount of hours she has to spend at work each week. The most of non-experimental research falls in one of these two broad categories: a correlation research or an observation research. The most common type of non-experimental research is correlation research. In this case, the researcher studies the relationship between two variables without the manipulation of the independent variable. For example, how the student's self-esteem correlates with their GPA. It would be highly unethical to manipulate students' self-esteem. A second type of non-experimental research is observational research. In this case, the researcher makes observation of subject behavior in a lab or in the real world. Speak about internal validity of the non-experimental research. An internal validity is the extent to which the design of a study supports the conclusion that changes in the independent variable cause any observed changes in the dependent variable. And non-experimental research has a lower internal validity because non-experimental designs utilize no control or manipulation of independent variable. In comparison, experimental research has higher internal validity. Let's focus on the correlational research. Why do researchers conduct correlational research? For example, when researchers believe that the relationship between variables is not causal, or when they are not interested in causal relationship. Another reason for using correlational research it is when the researcher believes that the relationship between the variables is causal, but they cannot manipulate the independent variable. For example, because of ethical reasons. Another reason is to check reliability and validity. For example, the researcher would like to compare a new short version of the test with an older, longer one. So, the researcher will correlate the scores from the shorter version with the longer version. This research is non-experimental because there is no independent variable in this research. Non-score in the shorter version of the test or score in the longer version of the test is independent or dependent variable. Another great advantage of the correlation research is its higher external validity. You may recall the trade-off between internal and external validities. Correlational research has lower internal validity but higher external validity. Since nothing is controlled or manipulated by the researcher, the results are more likely to reflect the relationships that exist in the real world. Correlations between quantitative variables are often presented using scatter plot. On this slide are 7 different scatter plots are being presented. Each point on the scatter plot are the data from one participant on both variables. A positive relationship it is when a higher scores on one variable are associated with the higher scores on the another variable. A negative relationship is when a higher scores on one variable are associated with the lower scores on the another variable. Please bear in mind that positivity or negativity of the relationship has nothing to do with the strength of the relationship. Both positive and negative relationship can be strong or weak. The strongest possible relationship is 1 or -1 in the case of negative relationship. Correlation coefficients near 0.5 are considered to be large, near 0.3 considered to be medium, and around 0.1 are considered to be weak. Again, this works for both positive and negative relationships. Pearson correlation coefficient that was used in this example is only good for a linear relationships, and nonlinear data are very common in psychology. For example, if we would look at the correlation between depression level and the amount of sleep, we will not see a linear relationship, but rather a U. format, because people who are severely depressed are often sleep either more than 8 hours or way less than 8 hours. Another restriction of use of correlation is when the variable used in the correlation research have a limited range in the sample relative to the population. On the slide there is presented data from the textbook about person's age and their enjoyment of the hip-hop music. You can see that with increased age, the person's enjoyment of the hip-hop music decreases. The overall correlation is quite strong, minus 0.77. But if we would like to sample the data only from the youngest group, from 18 to 24, the correlation will be much weaker. In fact, it will be around 0. There is no way that you study psychology and have never heard the saying, correlation does not imply causation. There are a lot of funny examples you can find at the internet. I chose one when the number of divorces in the main state in the US correlated with the amount of the consumption of the margarine. So, do you think that the amount of the consumption of margarine makes people in Maine divorce their loved one? Of course not. There are two reasons why correlation does not imply causation. One of them is the third variable problem. In our example with the number of divorces in the state Maine and the amount of consumed margarine, there is another third variable that causes changes in both our variables. I will say that the third variable is the amount of people living in the state of Maine. More people also means more divorces, and all these people will maybe eat more margarine. Another problem is directionality problem. I really like the example from the textbook about that people who exercise more are usually feel themselves better. In this case, you don't know what causes what. Do the people who feel themselves better have more energy for exercising, or maybe exercising makes people feel better? Most of the correlation researches involves measuring more than two variables and then assessing the statistical relationship between them. In these cases, a correlation matrix is being used. Do you know why only a half of the correlation matrix is being filled in? Well, because another half of the matrix will have exactly the same information, since we correlated each variable with each variable. And of course, the correlation of every variable with itself will be 1. So it will not give us any new information. Another technique worth to mention is factor analysis. A factor analysis is being used when researchers study relationships among large amount of fairly similar variables. Factor analysis organizes all these large numbers of variables into a small amount of clusters. Those clusters are being called factors. Variables from one factor are highly correlated among each other, but weakly correlated among other variables that are not in this factor. Factors are constructs that operate independently from each other. Factor analysis reveals the underlying structure of the connection between variables. It is up to the researcher to explain the nature of these connections. Complex correlations are often being used for the statistical control of third variable. Do you remember our correlation does not apply causation slide? Well, with usage of complex correlation, we can rule out possible interpretation. Let's use this funny example. the amount of consumed ice cream is positively correlated with the amount of sunburns. Is there another third variable that can cause changes in the amount of consumed ice creams and the amount of sunburns? We can personalize it and conduct correlations between all our three variables. In this case, we will use a partial correlation. Using partial correlation will allow us to examine the amount of consumed ice cream that is independent of the amount of sunburns and the amount of sunburns that are independent from the consumption of the ice cream. I haven't conducted any study for this example, but my hypothesis is that the partial correlation between the amount of the consumed ice cream and the amount of the sunburn when the temperature is being controlled would be zero or close to zero. When the relationship between two variables is being established, researchers can use regression analysis to make predictions about the value of one variable based on the value of another variable. The type of non-experimental research is observational research. The goal of observational study is to describe a variable or a set of variables. One type of observational research is naturalistic observation. In this case, researchers observe people's behavior in the environment where this behavior usually occurs. Researcher can be disguised, meaning that the people who are being observed are unaware of being observed. Alternatively, researcher can conduct an undisguised observation. In this case, people that being observed being informed about the research and the researcher. And undisguised observational research is usually being conducted in the cases when it will be unethical to conduct disguised observational research. There are some disadvantages while using this method. For example, participants can change their behavior knowing that they are being observed. This is called half-tone effect. Another type of the observation research is participant observation, meaning that the researcher is actively participating in the environment that they are studying. Again, participant observation can be disguised or undisguised. Another type of the observation is structured observation. In this case, the researcher makes careful observation of one or more specific behaviors in a particular setting that is more structured than the settings used in naturalistic or participant observation.